The topic of today's video is subscription licensing, and my goal is to give you a general idea of the different use cases that you can implement using subscription licensing. We're not going to go too much into the coding side today, although I will briefly mention a few tips when it comes to integrating with Stripe and other payment providers. But for now, let's start with a general idea and the different use cases that can be supported. So normally, I think the first thing that comes into mind when we mention subscription licensing is a use case where you have a product and the customer has to pay for it on a monthly, on a yearly basis. So they get the license and then it's limited to a specific time period. And once that time period expires, or once the license expires, then they either have to extend the license or the software will no longer work. That's one of the most common use cases. And typically, in the Cryptolens dashboard, you might have already noticed, so I have a testing product here. You have this field expires. And this is what you can use to keep track of when the license for a particular customer will expire and when they have to renew it. So we have mentioned this in other videos of how to set up time-limited licenses in Cryptolens, but I'll just quickly show you that if you click on Edit Feature Names, there is the box Treat all licenses as time limited. Once we click that, then Cryptolens will know that all licenses are time limited. And then we can go in and change, either set a specific date or, for example, or this license, for example, will expire in 4 days. So, for example, if I want to add 10 days, then we've extended it for 10 more days. Or you can pick a particular date in the calendar picker. So the expiry date is just like a normal field, such as, for example, it's the same way as features or the notes created. So it's just another field. And but when you tell Cryptolens that a license is time limited, then this allows the Cryptolens to know that, for example, once this expiry date is reached, then a certain action will be taken. So you can, for example, set it up so that all expired licenses are blocked, which would then support this first use case that we talked about, where access to the application will be blocked. So let's go back to the other use cases that you can support. So this is quite common, but there's another use case, and that is where you want to keep the access to the software, so even after the expiry date, but you want to have a way for, so you still want to incentivize your customers to extend the license, and the way you would incentivize them is that in order to get the latest version, they would also have a valid subscription. And they're different. So I have a picture here in the tutorial. So you can see, for example, let's say you have your 3 major releases, and then you might have minor releases. So let's suppose that the customer bought a license for version 1.0. Then you can allow them to use all minor versions, so 1.1, 1.2, etc. But then if they don't renew their license, then whenever you release version 2, so a major release, then that will no longer work, and that will incentivize them to upgrade, but they will still not block the older versions from working. So that's a different approach. So the first approach is where you block access entirely, and the second one is where you limit the updates that they can receive. The way to implement it, we covered in the article, but like they're different. You might already be aware that, for example, you have the notes field, but you can also click on the license and there's the data objects, which is the same thing as metadata. So it's like essentially a way for you to define additional parameters or different properties for a particular license. And then in here, for example, I could create a data object, let's see here, that is, let's suppose we call it major version, and then let's say the major version is 1, like that. And then you can keep track of that. And then whenever they extend the license, then you would change the major version to the next one that has been released. So that's one approach. You can read more about the technical side. I just want to give you a general idea of how it works, but you can read more about in the article. The final way of using this expiry field is to also have it to function as a maintenance or a support agreement type of setup. So, for example, you still allow them to access your software, but then if they want to receive updates, then they would have to have valid subscription for support agreement. So now we've covered 3 use cases, where the first one is where they need to have an active subscription in order to access the product at all. When they don't have it, it will no longer work. The second use case is where you limit the use for major releases, so they will not be able to upgrade to the newer versions. And the third one is where you give them access to the software itself, but then if they want to get support, then they would have to have a valid subscription. So this is something that you can also set up in Cryptolens. So for example, Cryptolens by default doesn't block any licenses. So you would have to go in, for example, let's say in the first use case that we described, then you could click on this block expired licenses, and then we'll make sure that they are all blocked at the expiry date. However, for example, if you want to support use case 2 and 3, then you don't want to block expired licenses, because you still want them to be able to use the software. Now, I want to give you, as a final part of the tutorial, I wanted to also discuss the integration side. So typically, when you work with the subscription licenses, it's very useful to be able to somehow extend this expiry date. In particular, for example, if you're charging your customers on a monthly basis, then it's not that might not be that good. It's not the ideal use case where you have to continuously extend the license whenever they extend, whenever you receive the payment. So you'd like an ideal use case is to be able to automate this. And there is a method in the Cryptolens API called the extend license method, and that's the one that you can call, for example, whenever a subscription in Stripe, in this case, whenever it is extended, then you can call the extend license method, and then it will add an additional period of time, so a month or a year or any period that you've defined. So that's the Stripe side of the Stripe part. So we do have, if you read more in the payment section, there is a recurring payment section. There is a guide on the first one I would recommend to review is the following one, integrating with external payment providers, and it will mention a few useful API methods that the change, for example, the extend a license or issue a license or change features and so forth, that are useful to know when it comes to the subscription licensing use case. And also to review the recurring pains with Stripe if you don't want to use the customer portal, if you want to have your own. However, of course, it's not limited to Stripe, and you can have any service, any other payment provider, or even your internal system call our API to extend or block a license depending on the status of the customer subscription. So that was everything that I wanted to cover in this tutorial. So most important that we talked about today, the 3 use cases. Some of the most common ones is the first is where you limit access to the software entirely when the expiry date has been reached. The second use case is where you allow customers to upgrade, you limit access to upgrades. And the third one is where you use this expiry field as a way to denote a subscription or support agreement. Thank you so much. Please let us know if you have any questions.